There is a moment, and I want you to really picture this. A night so quiet that even the wind holds its breath. Forest clearing. Silver moonlight pouring through the gaps in the trees like something spilled from a broken lantern. Two figures on opposite sides of that clearing. One crouching low, trembling with restrained fury, bones threatening to shift under skin that can barely contain what lives beneath it. The other completely still, the way only the dead can be still, pale as birch bark, eyes like red-black glass catching the moonlight, lips pulled back just slightly over teeth that were never meant to be gentle. Between them, a human, not running, not screaming, not even shaking, just standing there, arms out, eyes moving slowly from one creature to the other. And here's what I want you to ask yourself before we begin this story. What kind of person stands between a werewolf and a vampire, two of the oldest, most vicious natural enemies in all of mythology, and chooses not to run? Is it stupidity, bravery, some kind of death wish? Or is it something else entirely? Something the old stories never thought to give us a word for. Stay with me, 'cause this is not the story you think it is. This is not a love triangle. This is not a war story. This is not a tale about monsters tearing each other apart over a human prize. This is a story about a woman named Sable Voss, the only human being in 300 years of uneasy coexistence between two immortal bloodlines, who decided that peace was not a luxury. It was a choice, and she was going to make that choice even if it killed her, which for a while it almost did. The city of Velmoor, fictional but built from every dark corner of real mythology, existed in a kind of Cold War tension. Two factions, two ancient powers, and a human population that knew, on some deep ancestral level, that the things that hunted in the dark were real, even if they had no formal word for it. On one side, the Duskborn. The Duskborn were vampires, old ones, led by a creature who called himself Caeryn Ashveil, pronounced like Cairn, a vampire who had been alive since before the printing press, who wore three-piece suits like armor and spoke in a voice so controlled it felt like every syllable was a decision. Caeryn had built the Duskborn into something resembling civilization. They fed on willing donors. They kept records. They had rules, brutal yes, but rules nonetheless. He was not kind, but he was calculated. And calculation in monsters is sometimes the closest thing to mercy you're going to get. Caeryn's second-in-command was a woman named Thessaly Morn, a vampire of roughly 2 centuries, with a particular talent for information. What Caeryn decided, Thessaly executed. What Caeryn didn't know, Thessaly found out. She was the intelligence of the Duskborn. Sharp, cold, and utterly loyal to a system she believed in, even if she didn't always believe in the man who ran it. On the other side, the Ashpact. The Ashpact were werewolves. Not the movie monster kind. Not the mindless beasts. These were people. Deeply, profoundly people, in ways that made their animal nature feel like a second language rather than a cage. Led by a man named Draven Locke, early 40s, broad as a doorway, with a kind of face that has been broken and reset enough times that it tells a story before he opens his mouth. The Ashpact were not organized the way the Duskborn were. They were a pack. Family. Messy and passionate and intensely loyal in ways that vampires, with their long centuries of solitude and strategy, often couldn't understand. Draven's right hand was a young woman named Rika Thornhide, 26, fast, ferocious, and possessed of a temper that she wore openly in a way that made her simultaneously the most dangerous and most honest person in any room she entered. Where Draven thought before he moved, Rika moved and thought simultaneously. She was the Ashpact's blade. Between these two groups, a peace agreement. The Velmoor Accord. 14 years old and already rotting from the inside. The accord said, Duskborn keep to the eastern districts. Ashpact keep to the western hills. No hunting on each other's territory. No turning humans without consent. No acts of aggression that could be traced back to either group. It was the kind of peace that only lasts as long as neither side is hungry or angry or insulted. Which, for creatures defined by hunger and anger, is not a particularly long time. And then, 8 months before our story begins, something happened that cracked the accord down the middle. A young werewolf, barely 20, a boy named Fetch, real name Phelan Oren, went missing in the eastern districts. The Duskborn swore they had nothing to do with it. The Ashpact didn't believe them. 3 weeks later, Fetch turned up alive but wrong. Something had happened to him in those weeks. He wouldn't speak about it. He couldn't shift anymore. And he smelled, to every member of the Ashpact, faintly of grave cold and stone, the scent markers of a vampire's prolonged presence. Draven Locke went to Caeryn Ashveil with a demand and a barely contained rage. Caeryn responded with denial and a barely concealed contempt. Thessaly suggested, with perfect diplomatic smoothness, that perhaps the boy had simply had an accident. Rika Thornhide, standing behind Draven in that meeting, said nothing. But her hands were shaking. After that, the killing started. Not declared war. Both sides were too careful for that. But edges. Provocations. A Duskborn scout found dead just inside the Ashpact's territory line. An Ashpact courier ambushed and severely injured in an alley near the eastern docks. Messages that could be interpreted as threats. Silence where there used to be at least the pretense of communication. The accord was not broken. Not technically. But it was being murdered slowly. This is the world that Sable Voss drove into on a Tuesday night in November, in a car with 2 broken tail lights and a box of her belongings in the back seat. Here's what you need to understand about Sable Voss before anything else. She was not special in the way that usually gets you noticed in these kinds of stories. She wasn't the chosen one. She didn't have a prophecy. She wasn't descended from some ancient bloodline of monster hunters or celestial mediators. She didn't have supernatural powers hiding just below the surface of her ordinary life, waiting for the right dramatic moment to emerge. She was a 31-year-old conflict resolution specialist, basically a professional peacemaker, who had spent the last 6 years working for a private mediation firm that contracted with corporations, criminal organizations, and occasionally governments to resolve disputes before they became wars. She was good at reading rooms. She was better at reading people. She had a particular talent, developed through years of sitting between parties who despised each other, for finding the thing that neither side was saying but both sides needed to hear. She had moved to Velmoor for a job. Contract. A client who had found her through a chain of referrals so long and so strange that she hadn't asked too many questions, because the money was exceptional and she had student loans that disagreed with her principals. The client was Caeryn Ashveil, though she didn't know that yet. She knew him at first only as a voice on the phone, smooth, controlled, faintly accented in a way she couldn't place geographically, who told her that he represented a group with a significant territorial dispute and asked if she had experience mediating between parties with fundamentally incompatible worldviews. She told him that was basically her entire career. He said good. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know yet, was that Caeryn Ashveil had not hired her because he wanted peace. He had hired her because he wanted leverage. In his calculation, a human mediator gave the Duskborn a kind of optics advantage. If the Ashpact refused to engage with mediation, they looked like the unreasonable party. If they agreed, Caeryn had a neutral party who could potentially be guided to the right conclusions. He had hired Sable Voss as a prop. She had been a prop before. She usually figured it out fairly quickly. The night she arrived in Velmoor, she stopped at a diner near the edge of the city, the kind of place that exists in every city, that serves coffee at 2 in the morning without asking why you need it. She sat at the counter, ate an indifferent piece of pie, and listened. She had a habit of listening to rooms. The frequencies of them. The way tension changes the timbre of conversation. She couldn't explain exactly how it worked. She'd tried in job interviews, and it always came out sounding like something between instinct and mild synesthesia. She just knew when a room held something unsaid. When the air was thick with undisclosed stakes. The diner felt like a room where everyone was looking at the door. She left a good tip and drove to the apartment she'd rented sight unseen and lay on a bare mattress with her coat on, staring at the ceiling, already aware that this job was going to be stranger than the briefing document suggested. She was right about that. Her first meeting with Caeryn Ashveil took place in the Duskborn's primary holding, a building in the Eastern District that presented itself to the human world as a private events venue. Inside, past the lobby and the tasteful lighting and the front desk human who looked mildly haunted, it was something else. Old stone. High ceilings. The kind of silence that had been cultivated deliberately over decades. Caeryn met her in a conference room. Thessaly Morn stood in the corner, tablet in hand, watching Sable with the attentive stillness of a cat watching something that hasn't realized it's being watched. Caeryn explained the situation in the language of a corporate dispute. Territory. Resources. Breach of agreement. He was careful. Measured. He gave her only the information that supported his framing of events. The Ashpact as the aggressor, the Duskborn as the aggrieved party seeking resolution through proper channels. Sable took notes, asked clarifying questions. At one point she said, "And what does the other party claim happened to the young man who went missing?" Caeryn said, "They claim we were responsible. We were not." Thessaly, from the corner, said nothing. But her pen stopped moving for exactly 2 seconds. Sable noticed. She left the meeting with a contract signed, a retainer deposited, and a very clear sense that she'd been given a performance rather than a briefing. Getting to the Ashpact was harder. They hadn't agreed to mediation. They didn't trust it. When Sable called the number Caeryn had provided for the Ashpact's representative, a number that rang 4 times before being answered by someone who sounded like they were outdoors in a wind, she was told, with considerable economy of language, that they weren't interested. She said, "I understand. I'd like to come speak with you anyway. Not on behalf of my client. Just as a conversation." The voice said, "Why?" She said, "Because I already know I've been given a partial picture, and I'm not useful to anyone working from a partial picture." There was a long silence. Then the voice said, "Come to the west gate of the Harrow Hills Park. Tomorrow night. 10 o'clock. Come alone. If you bring anyone from the Duskborn, we'll know." She said, "I'll be alone." The voice, which she would later learn belonged to Rika Thornhide, said, "We know what you smell like now. Don't lie to us about this." Sable hung up and sat very still for a moment, processing the implications of being told that she had already been scented by creatures she hadn't yet met. Then she made a cup of tea and reviewed her notes because that was what you did. The meeting at the Harrow Hills Park went like this. Sable arrived at 9:50. She sat on a bench near the west gate with her coat pulled around her and her notebook on her knee, and she waited. At 10:03, she noted the time. Rika Thornhide appeared from between 2 trees and stood about 15 feet away and looked at her with the frank, evaluating gaze of someone deciding whether a situation is dangerous. Draven Locke appeared a moment later, from a different direction, and stood with his arms crossed. Sable looked at them both. She did not stand. She did not reach for anything. She said, "Thank you for coming." Rika said, "You're not afraid." Sable said, "I'm a little afraid. I'm reasonably good at not showing it." Draven said, "Why?" She said, "Showing fear when you're trying to open a dialogue is counterproductive. It frames the negotiation wrong from the start. I'm not here to be prey. I'm here to listen." There was another long silence. Then Draven walked forward and sat on the far end of the bench, maintaining distance but sitting. That was the gesture that mattered. Rika remained standing, but her arms uncrossed. For the next 2 hours, Sable listened to a very different version of the same story. From the Ashpact's telling, Phelan Oren Fetch had been a curious, sometimes reckless young man who had gone into the Eastern Districts against pack orders because he had, against all sense, started a friendship with a young Duskborn vampire named Sorrel Vane. The friendship had been discovered by Caeryn Ashveil, who had responded to it with a particular brand of control that the Duskborn reserved for elements that threatened their structure. Sorrel Vane had subsequently been removed from contact with the pack. Phelan Oren had been found wandering near the border 3 weeks later, unable to shift, unable to explain what had happened to him. Sable asked, "Do you believe Caeryn personally authorized what happened to Phelan?" Draven said, "I believe he created the conditions." Sable asked, "Where is Sorrel Vane now?" Rika and Draven looked at each other. Then Draven said, "We don't know. Sable wrote this down. She underlined it twice. She left the meeting in the park with a much fuller picture, a list of questions, and a bone-deep certainty that the person who was going to end up holding the most dangerous information in Velmoor was going to be her. Finding Sorrel Vane took Sable 11 days. During those 11 days she operated as a mediator on paper, scheduling preliminary communication sessions between the Duskborn and the Ashpact that neither side attended with any real intention of progress, documenting positions and counterpositions, filing reports to Caeryn that were careful and uninflammatory, and meeting Rika Thornhide for coffee twice at a diner in the neutral district that she had designated as her working space. The second coffee meeting was where Rika told her something she hadn't told Draven yet. She said, "I think Phelan went with them voluntarily. First, I think he trusted Sorrel, and Sorrel might have even been trying to protect him. But somewhere in there someone else got involved. Someone from the inner circle." Sable asked, "Does that change your position on the accord?" Rika said, "It changes whether I can tell Draven the truth without him burning the Eastern District down." Sable understood then what Rika was carrying. The knowledge that her alpha, her family's leader, was operating on an incomplete version of events. And that completing the version might cost more than the incomplete one. She said, "I can carry some of this for you. That's actually what I'm for." Rika looked at her for a long time. Then she said, "You're not what I expected." Sable said, "What did you expect?" Rika said, "Something Caeryn could use." Sable said, "He thinks I am something he can use. I'm letting him think that for now because it's keeping me alive and giving me access." Rika made a sound that was half laugh, half exhale. "You're going to get yourself killed," she said. Sable said, "I've been told that on 7 separate contracts. I'm still here." Sorrel Vane turned out to be hidden inside Velmoor's neutral district, a stretch of the city that neither the Duskborn nor the Ashpact formally controlled, populated mostly by humans who were, to varying degrees, aware of what lived around them. Sorrel was living in a basement apartment under a bookshop, fed by a small network of willing donors, surviving on the margins in a way that young vampires without faction protection almost never managed. Sable found her through a chain of careful conversations and a name she'd picked up from Thessaly Morn's financial records, which she had obtained through means that were technically outside her contract but well within her professional ethics as she defined them. Sorrel Vane was 23 years old in human appearance, which meant, in vampire terms, that she had been turned somewhere between 23 and 30 years ago. She had the look of someone who had been afraid for a long time and had gotten very good at pretending otherwise. She opened her apartment door and looked at Sable and said, "You're the mediator." Sable said, "You've heard of me." Sorrel said, "Everyone's heard of you. Caeryn talks about you in meetings. He thinks you're going to fix this for him." Sable said, "I'm going to fix this. Just not for him." She was led inside. What Sorrel told her over the next 3 hours reframed everything. The friendship between Sorrel and Phelan Oren had been real, genuinely real, the kind of connection that happens when two young people from opposite sides of a war find each other in the neutral space and discover that the mythology they've been raised on doesn't match the actual person standing in front of them. Phelan was curious and warm and treated Sorrel like a person rather than a predator. Sorrel had never really had that before. When Caeryn discovered it, he hadn't been angry in the way that Draven Locke had assumed. He had been strategic. He'd seen an opportunity. He had brought Phelan Oren in, not violently, but under Sorrel's unwilling guidance, with the promise that Phelan would be released unharmed if Sorrel cooperated. And he had spent 3 weeks extracting information from Phelan about the Ashpact, pack movements, safe houses, the locations of their secondary territories. Not through torture. Through the kind of subtle, sustained psychological pressure that Caeryn Ashveil had perfected over centuries. The kind that leaves no marks. Phelan couldn't shift anymore because the process had fundamentally altered something in his nervous system. Not intentionally, but as collateral damage of having a vampire's sustained influence pressing on his psyche for 3 weeks. Sorrel had complied to protect Phelan. Then, when Phelan was released, she had fled, because she knew what Caeryn would do to her once her usefulness had ended. She had one piece of information that she had kept from Caeryn. hidden, guarded with her survival. Something she had learned during those 3 weeks that was more valuable than anything she'd given him. She told Sable what it was. Sable sat very still for a moment. Then she said, "I need you to stay exactly where you are and not contact anyone until I tell you to move." Sorrel said, "And why would I trust you?" Sable said, "Because right now I'm the only person in this city who knows the whole story. And knowing the whole story is the only thing that's going to keep both you and Phelan Oren alive. Remember the image I gave you at the beginning. Clearing. Silver moonlight. 2 creatures. 1 human. Arms out. That moment happens on a Thursday night, 3 weeks after Sable finds Sorrel Vane, during a meeting she had arranged, officially for the purposes of a formal opening session of mediation. The first time both factions would be in the same physical space since the deterioration of the Accord. She had spent those 3 weeks doing something that no mediator in her professional career had ever told her was part of the job description. She had been quietly, methodically, and with the calm precision of someone defusing a bomb, constructing the truth. Not a version of the truth. Not a narrative that favored one side. The actual complete architecture of what had happened to Phelan Oren and why, what Caeryn had done and why, what the information he'd extracted meant and what it could be used for, and, crucially, what would happen to both the Duskborn and the Ashpact if that information was deployed versus what would happen if it was destroyed. She had not told Caeryn what she knew. She had not told Draven either. She had held it all in herself like a held breath, because the moment she told either side, the moment became theirs. And she needed the moment to stay hers long enough to matter. The meeting location, a building in the neutral district. A converted warehouse with high ceilings and no good hiding places and, as Sable had specified to both parties, limited interior cover for anything supernatural that might feel the urge to escalate dramatically. Caeryn came with Thessaly Morn and 2 other Duskborn who stood by the door and said nothing. He was composed in the way of stone, completely, naturally still. Draven came with Rika and 4 Ashpact members who arranged themselves with the practiced casualness of a pack who knows exactly what each of them will do the moment something goes wrong. Draven was visibly containing something. Rika caught Sable's eye when she walked in and made a very small gesture that Sable interpreted as, "This is close." Sable stood at the center of the room. She said, "Thank you for coming. I'm going to begin this session differently than you're expecting." Caeryn said pleasantly, "Of course." Draven said nothing. She said, "I'm going to tell you what I know. All of it. And I'm going to ask both of you to listen without speaking until I've finished. If you decide to end this meeting or take action against me after I'm done, that's your right. But I'm asking for 10 minutes first." Caeryn's composure shifted fractionally. Just a tightening around the eyes. "That's an unusual approach for a mediator," he said. She said, "I found Sorrel Vane." The room went very still. Sable kept speaking. She laid out everything. Phelan's abduction, the 3 weeks of extraction, the mechanism of what had been done to his ability to shift, the information Caeryn had obtained and what it meant. She spoke clearly and without emphasis, the way you deliver a diagnosis. Not to wound, to inform. She watched Draven Locke's face as she spoke. She watched him move from tightly contained to something that was no longer containable. She watched his hands grip the edge of the table. She watched Rika Thornhide go very quiet in the specific way of someone who is deciding whether to prevent something or allow it. She watched Caeryn Ashveil's face too. Watched the calculation moving behind his eyes. Watched him assess. Watched him decide that denial was no longer the play, that he was already past the point where denial served him. When she finished, there was a silence that lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then Draven Locke stood up and the table cracked under his hands and the air in the room changed temperature, and Caeryn Ashveil was on his feet with a speed that shouldn't have been possible, and Thessaly Morn produced something from inside her jacket, and 2 Ashpact members were no longer fully human in the way they had been 10 seconds ago, and Sable stepped into the center of the space between them. "Arms out. Voice come." She said, "Stop." Here's the thing about that moment that the old stories never get right. It's not that she was brave enough to stand between them. Bravery is a feeling, And feelings don't stop a werewolf mid-transformation or give a vampire a reason to retract what it was about to do. What stopped them was this. She said one more thing. She said, I also know what Caeryn planned to do with the information he extracted from Phelan Oren. And if you kill each other in this room tonight, that plan will proceed without him to moderate it. And you will both lose everything you've built. She looked at Caeryn. She said, You know Sorrel told me. She looked at Draven. She said, And you need to know that what he built with that information is bigger than this room. Bigger than tonight. And the only way to dismantle it safely is for both of you to be alive and cooperative long enough for me to show you how. Another silence. Longer. Rika Thornhide said, What did he build? And Sable said, A network. Inside the neutral district. Using the Ashpact's own safehouse locations. Sold to third parties who have been making arrangements for a long time. Arrangements that, once triggered, would make the Accord irrelevant. Because there would be nothing left of either faction's infrastructure to anchor a peace to. She let that sit. Then she said, Caeryn didn't do this to start a war. He did it to consolidate. To be the only power standing when the others were too destabilized to function. He was going to sacrifice the Accord to win the territory. Draven looked at Caeryn. His voice was very, very quiet. Is this true? Caeryn was silent for 3 seconds. And then he said, Some of it. Which, in Sable's experience, always meant all of it. What followed the warehouse meeting was 6 weeks of the most exhausting work Sable had done in her career. She spent the first week dismantling Caeryn's network. Or rather, facilitating its dismantlement. The third-party arrangements he had made had involved 3 human intermediaries and 1 rogue Duskborn operative named Varro Quell. A vampire of particular cunning who had been serving as Caeryn's shadow architect on the project. Exposing Varro and neutralizing the arrangements required Sable to negotiate separately with each of the human intermediaries, who were, in their varying degrees, terrified, coordinate with both the Duskborn's internal security, Thessaly Morn, who was furious at her employer for putting her in this position, and the Ashpact's intel wing, Rika Thornhide, who was furious at the world in general but particularly useful. Thessaly Morn, in the process of this work, became something unexpected. An ally. Not a warm one. Not a friend. But a person who, faced with the full scope of what Caeryn had done and the professional implications for her own integrity, chose to side with dismantlement rather than concealment. She was precise and she was fast and she communicated with Sable in clipped, accurate messages that said exactly as much as was necessary and not a syllable more. Sable found this deeply refreshing. Phelan Oren, fetch, was another matter. He was brought to a meeting in the 2nd week, at his own request. He had heard that the person responsible for the mediation effort was involved in investigating what had happened to him. He wanted to understand the scope. He sat across from Sable in a diner and looked at her with eyes that were older than 20 years should have made them, and he said, Will I be able to shift again? Sable said, I don't know. I'm not the right person to ask. I can connect you with people who might know more. He said, Is this going to be worth it? All of this? Whatever you're trying to do. She said, I can't promise you that. I can promise you that the alternative is definitely worse. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Sorrel didn't want to do it. What she did to me. You should know that. Sable said, I know. He said, Is she okay? She said, She's alive. She's somewhere safe. She's going to have the chance to be okay when this is settled. He nodded slowly, said nothing else, finished his coffee, left. The negotiation itself, the formal architecture of a new accord, took the remaining 5 weeks. Sable had dealt with more complex contractual disputes in her career, in terms of the sheer number of clauses and counterproposals. But she had never dealt with parties who communicated simultaneously in good faith, and in the implicit language of thousands of years of hostile coexistence. Every agreement had to be translated twice. Once into the legal and structural framework that both sides could formally sign. And once into the deeper symbolic language, the acknowledgement of grievances, the assignment of responsibility, The construction of a narrative that both sides could carry forward without feeling that they had surrendered something essential. This second translation was the harder work. And it was the work that no one but Sable could do, because it required being genuinely outside both systems while being genuinely trusted by both. The hardest part was Caeryn. Not because he was obstinate. In fact, the Caeryn Ashveil who sat across from Sable in the later weeks of negotiation was a fundamentally different interlocutor than the one who had hired her as a prop. He had been exposed, and exposure had done something complicated to him. It had not humbled him exactly, but it had made him legible in a way he hadn't been before. She could see the machinery now. And the machinery was, in its way, genuinely afraid of irrelevance. Of having built something for centuries only to have it collapse because he had overplayed. She sat with him one evening, just the two of them, Thessaly having stepped out, and she said, "Why the network? You had the information. You could have used it directly against the Ashpact. Why the slow dismantlement?" He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Because I don't want to destroy them. I want to be the only option." "There is a difference," she said. "Is there?" He said, "To me, yes." She said, "That's the part that's going to prevent you from ever truly operating in good faith with any accord. You understand that?" He said, "I understand that you believe that." She said, "We're going to build language into this agreement that makes unilateral consolidation an explicit violation. And you're going to sign it." He said, "And if I don't?" She said, "Then Draven Locke learns the full scope of the network's intended purpose, and you spend the next decade rebuilding from rubble." Caeryn was quiet for a long time. Then, with something that was not quite a smile and not quite anything else, he said, "You would have made an excellent vampire." She said, "I'll take that as a compliment and keep my original biology, thank you." He signed. The second Velmoor Accord was signed on a cold Saturday morning in the neutral district, in a rented conference room with terrible carpet and good natural light. Both sides came with their seconds. Caeryn with Thessaly, Draven with Rika. Sable sat at the head of the table and read the major clauses aloud, slowly, precisely, and then passed the document to Caeryn, who signed it with a pen he had brought himself, because of course he had. Then to Draven, who signed it with a borrowed pen and a face that was unreadable except by Rika, who was quietly doing the emotional arithmetic of what this moment cost him. After the signing, there was a silence that lasted about 15 seconds and felt much longer. Then Rika Thornhide said, "Is there food?" There was not. Sable went and got sandwiches from the cafe down the street, and they ate them in the conference room with a terrible carpet, and it was awkward and strange and nothing like a diplomatic triumph. Caeryn did not eat because he did not eat. Thessaly ate precisely half of one sandwich, and put the rest down with the expression of someone honoring a formality. Draven ate 2 sandwiches in rapid succession, and looked slightly less volatile afterward. Sable ate her sandwich and felt the particular exhaustion that comes after a large thing is finished, the kind that is mostly relief with grief underneath it because large things always cost something, and you only feel the full weight of the cost when they're done. Before she left, Draven Locke stopped her near the door. He said, "I need to ask you something." She said, "Okay." He said, "Why did you do this?" "Not the job. You had options. You could have managed this to Caeryn's advantage and collected your fee and gone home. Why the full picture? Why the risk?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because the incomplete picture was going to get people killed. And I can't do a job that gets people killed. That's the line I work from." He said, "That's it." She said, "That's it." He looked at her for a long time with that face that tells stories in its scars and its weathered lines. Then he said, "In the pack we have a word for someone who does that. Stands in the middle of something for principle, not for gain." She said, "What's the word?" He said, "Bridgeborn. It's old. Doesn't get used much because the people it applies to tend to have short lives." She said, "That's not encouraging." He said, "It's honest." She smiled. Said, "Then I'll take it." Sable Voss left Velmoor on a Thursday, 3 days after the signing of the new accord. Her car still had broken tail lights. She had not gotten around to fixing them. She drove out in the early morning before the city had fully woken up. Through the neutral district, past the bookshop where Sorrel and Phelan had spent 2 hours talking about things she hadn't asked about. Through the eastern edge of the city where the Duskborn's buildings caught the early light and held it in ways that regular glass didn't. Past the beginning of the road that led to the western hills. She stopped at the diner where she'd eaten pie on her first night in Velmoor. Ordered coffee and something for the road. The woman behind the counter was the same one who had served her that first night. She looked at Sable with a recognition that didn't quite become conversation, and then said, "You leaving?" Sable said, "Yes." The woman said, "Things feel quieter around the city." Sable said, "That's the plan." The woman refilled her coffee without asking and put an extra piece of pie in a box. Sable ate the pie in the car and thought about Draven Locke's word. Bridgeborn. She thought about Rika Thornhide, who had sent her a message the day after the signing that said only, "Good work." And Thessaly Morn, who had sent nothing, but had shaken her hand with a grip precise enough to communicate several things at once. And Caeryn Ashveil, who had watched her leave the conference room and said, in that carefully controlled voice, "If you find yourself in need of work in the future, I would not decline a referral." Which was, she suspected, the closest he had come to a genuine compliment in decades. She thought about Sorrel Vane, who was going to be given a formal status within the neutral district's de facto governance structure as part of the Accord's small print provisions. Not Duskborn, not Ashpact, but recognized. Allowed to exist in the space between. Sable had fought for that clause with more energy than almost any other. She thought about Phelan Oren, who might or might not regain his ability to shift, who had carried something through that experience that made him older than 20 but also, somehow, more himself than he had been before. Who had told her, in their one brief conversation, that he didn't regret any of it. Not the danger. Not what it cost him. Because he had met someone real in the middle of it. She drove for a while in the early light, with the city behind her and the long road ahead, and she felt the weight of what she was carrying. Not just the exhaustion but the stories. Velmoor would go on without her. The Accord would hold or it wouldn't. Caeryn would either grow into a version of himself capable of operating in good faith or he wouldn't. Draven would rebuild what had been damaged and forge the pack into something that could navigate the new terms of the peace or he wouldn't. She had done what she could. Given them the fullest possible picture and the best possible architecture for a future. What they built in it was not hers to carry. But she carried the word. Bridgeborn. She had looked it up, in the etymological records she kept for exactly this kind of thing, and found echoes of it in several mythological traditions. The Bridgeborn were the ones who stood in the crossing points. Not safe on either bank. Not drowning in the river. Walking the bridge that both sides needed but neither side could build alone, because building it required standing in the middle where neither side's rules applied and the only governing principle was, "This must hold." She had done that work before with human clients in human disputes with human stakes. Turned out to be the same work. Just with longer memories on either side. She stopped for gas at the edge of the city limits, and while the tank was filling she stood in the cold morning air and looked back at Velmoor. The skyline was ordinary. The lights still on in the early hours. Cars beginning to move through the streets. Humans living their lives, aware on some ancestral level that the dark held things, but mostly managing to go about their business anyway. Which was, she thought, its own kind of remarkable courage. She got back in the car, adjusted the mirror, pulled out of the gas station onto the long road south. Behind her, Velmoor receded. And the day began.